Tonight, when you lie down to sleep, the position your body settles into for the next several hours may be doing something to your heart and your blood vessels that you've never once stopped to consider, and that most doctors never bring up during a standard appointment because there simply isn't time for it in a 15-minute visit focused on blood pressure numbers and medication refills. There is one sleeping position in particular that significantly elevates the strain on your cardiovascular system during the hours when your body is least equipped to compensate for that strain. And for people over 60 who are managing blood pressure, heart concerns, or who snore regularly, that combination creates a risk that deserves to be taken seriously and understood clearly. By the time we finish today, you're going to know exactly which position I'm talking about, exactly what it does to your cardiovascular system while you sleep, and exactly what you can start doing differently tonight without buying anything, without a prescription, and without a dramatic change to anything other than where you place your body in the bed. I'm Dr. Hale Thorne, and I've spent more than 30 years in clinical medicine, a substantial part of that time focused specifically on cardiovascular health in patients over 60, because the heart, more than almost any other organ in the body, tells a different story after 60 than it told at 40. And understanding that story is genuinely one of the most important things a person in your age group can do for their long-term health. And I'll be honest with you, I changed my own sleeping position years ago based on exactly the information I'm going to share with you today, and I did it because when you understand what's actually happening to your heart while you sleep in a position that increases its workload, choosing differently becomes an obvious decision rather than a difficult one. Before we get into it, I want to ask you something down in the comments. Tell me your age and tell me honestly, which position do you most naturally sleep in? On your back, on your side, on your stomach, or some combination of all three? I read every single comment on these videos, and it genuinely shapes what I decide to cover going forward, so don't hold back. There's no wrong answer here, only honest information that helps all of us understand this better together. Let me start by explaining something about what your cardiovascular system is actually doing while you sleep, because most people assume sleep is simply a period of complete physiological rest, during which the body essentially pauses and recovers. The reality is considerably more nuanced than that. And understanding the nuance is what makes the sleeping position conversation actually meaningful, rather than just alarming. Your heart rate does slow during sleep, your blood pressure drops somewhat, your breathing becomes more regular, and your body shifts the balance of its nervous system activity in ways that are genuinely restorative. But the heart never stops working. It never takes a complete rest. And the position your body is in for the hours you're asleep directly influences how hard your heart has to work to do its job, how effectively blood moves through the body, and how well the airway stays open, which matters more than most people realize for cardiovascular health specifically. The position I'm most concerned about, the one the research identifies most consistently as adding cardiovascular strain during sleep, is sleeping flat on your back, the supine position. And before you dismiss this because you've slept on your back your whole life without incident, I want to walk you through exactly what happens mechanically, because once you understand the mechanism, the concern makes immediate, intuitive sense. When you lie flat on your back, gravity acts on all of the soft tissue in your throat and upper airway in a very specific way. The tongue, the soft palate, and the surrounding tissue all fall backward under their own weight, narrowing the airway passage with every breath you take. For people who have any degree of airway narrowing from other factors, which becomes increasingly common with age as tissue tone decreases throughout the body generally, including the muscles that hold the airway open, this narrowing can cross a threshold into what we call obstructive sleep apnea, meaning the airway collapses partially or completely during an inhale. The breath stops for a moment or several moments, and then the body startles itself awake just enough to restore the airway and restart breathing. Most people with sleep apnea have no memory of these episodes whatsoever. From the inside, the night seems entirely normal, perhaps slightly restless, but normal. They simply know they don't sleep well, or their partner knows because the snoring and the pauses in breathing have become impossible to share a room with, sometimes impossible to share a floor of the house with. What most people don't know, including many of my own patients before we've had this conversation directly, is what's happening to their cardiovascular system during each of those episodes, because what's happening is genuinely alarming once you understand it. When the airway collapses and breathing stops, even momentarily, blood oxygen levels begin to drop. The brain detects this drop essentially immediately through dedicated sensors in the blood vessels, and the response is an activation of the sympathetic nervous system, the same physiological response your body produces when it senses immediate physical danger, because from the brain's perspective, A sudden drop in blood oxygen is exactly that, a threat requiring immediate emergency response. Heart rate accelerates, sometimes dramatically. Blood pressure spikes, sometimes to values significantly above what the person's baseline blood pressure runs during the day. Blood vessels constrict. The entire cardiovascular system is asked to perform at an elevated emergency level in a matter of seconds in a person who is supposed to be asleep and recovering. And for someone with moderate to severe sleep apnea, this emergency response can happen dozens or even hundreds of times in a single night, every night, year after year. The person sleeping through all of it genuinely experiences none of it consciously, but their heart experiences every single one. And over time, that repeated cardiovascular activation during what should be a recovery period takes a toll that accumulates in ways that eventually become visible as high blood pressure that's difficult to control despite medication, as cardiac arrhythmias that develop seemingly out of nowhere, and as elevated stroke risk, because the chronic inflammation and vascular strain from years of these nightly surges damages the blood vessels in ways that increase the probability of a clot forming or a vessel rupturing at some point during one of these episodes or in the period following them. And all of this is dramatically worse when a person is sleeping on their back. The supine position is the single most favorable position for airway collapse in someone who has any predisposition to it. And because that predisposition increases with age as tissue tone decreases throughout the body, the number of people over 60 for whom this is a meaningful concern is substantially higher than most people assume. Most of them have never been told. Most of them will never be told, unless they happen to have a partner who notices the snoring and the pauses, or they happen to ask the right question, or they happen to watch a video like this one. Let me tell you about a patient of mine, a man named Robert, 69 years old, a retired electrical engineer who came to me for a routine cardiovascular checkup and mentioned almost in passing that his wife had started sleeping in the guest room because she couldn't sleep through his snoring anymore. Something that had been building gradually over the previous few years before finally crossing a threshold of disruption that forced the change. She described to him on multiple occasions that she'd noticed him stop breathing for what seemed like several seconds during the night and then gasp and restart, something she described as both frightening to watch and impossible to unsee once she'd noticed it the first time. Robert had been vaguely aware of the snoring, the way most people are aware of a habit that others notice more than they do, but the apnea episodes were news to him in any meaningful sense, and he'd been somewhat dismissive of the concerns his wife had raised over the previous 2 years, the way many people are dismissive of concerns about things they can't directly experience themselves. When I looked at Robert's blood pressure history across recent months, something wasn't adding up in a way that should have been easier to explain than it was. His medication was well chosen and appropriately dosed, and yet his morning readings specifically were consistently running 8 to 12 points higher than his afternoon and evening readings, a pattern that in isolation might be attributed to various factors, but in the context of what his wife was describing pointed strongly towards significant cardiovascular activation happening specifically during his sleep. Activation that was still reflected in an elevated blood pressure reading when he woke up each morning before the daytime pattern had a chance to normalize it. I ordered a formal sleep study, which he wore at home over 2 nights, and the results confirmed moderate to severe obstructive sleep apnea, with the great majority of his apnea events occurring specifically in the periods when the study's position sensor recorded him as lying on his back. He was a confirmed back sleeper. He'd always been a back sleeper, as far back as he could remember, and the idea of sleeping in any other position felt genuinely alien and uncomfortable to him, in a way I hear from almost every habitual back sleeper I've ever discussed this with. We took a 2-pronged approach. First, a simple positional intervention to discourage back sleeping, which I'll describe in detail shortly. Second, CPAP therapy for the apnea itself, which he was initially resistant to but agreed to try after we talked through what his cardiovascular system had actually been experiencing every night for what was likely years. At his 6-month follow-up, his morning blood pressure readings had normalized to the point where his prescribing doctor was genuinely considering reducing one of his medications, which is an outcome that almost never happens on its own, without a meaningful underlying change. More importantly, his wife had moved back into the bedroom. He told me with genuine bemusement that it had taken watching his wife look frightened every time he stopped breathing for him to take seriously something he'd been dimly aware of for years. That is a more common story than most people realize. Now, a quick pause here. If you've made it this far, you're clearly taking this seriously, and I want you to go ahead and tap that like button. It genuinely helps this information reach more people who need to hear it. And let me know in the comments, do you snore? Does your partner ever mention pauses in your breathing at night? These are genuinely important questions, and the comments section of a video like this is often where people first admit things they've been half aware of for years. Let me talk about who is most at risk from this specific combination of back sleeping and cardiovascular strain, because this isn't a uniform risk that applies equally to every person who happens to sleep on their back. And understanding the specific risk factors helps people assess their own situation more accurately than a blanket warning ever could. The risk is most elevated for people who are over 60 because tissue tone in the airway decreases with age in ways that make airway collapse more likely at any given degree of positional narrowing, and this change accelerates rather than plateaus as the decades progress. It's more elevated for people who carry any significant weight around the neck and upper chest because that additional soft tissue mass adds direct gravitational load on the airway when lying flat, narrowing the passage even before the tongue and soft palate contribute their own weight. It's more elevated for people who already manage high blood pressure, because the nighttime sympathetic surges we've been discussing don't just add workload to the heart, they actively interfere with the normal overnight blood pressure dipping pattern that healthy cardiovascular systems depend on for genuine recovery. And that interference compounds the strain from whatever daytime blood pressure situation is already being managed with medication. And it's more elevated for people who regularly drink alcohol in the evenings, because alcohol relaxes the muscles of the upper airway more than baseline, further lowering the threshold at which airway collapse occurs in the supine position, which is exactly why many people notice that their snoring is significantly worse on nights when they've had a glass or two before bed, and why mornings after evening drinking can leave them feeling distinctly less rested despite more hours in bed. I had another patient I want to tell you about, a woman named Patricia, 72 years old. A retired hospital administrator who had managed her blood pressure for about 8 years on a relatively modest medication regimen and had been doing well by most measures. She came to me initially because of morning headaches that had been occurring with increasing frequency over the previous 6 months, specifically headaches that were present when she woke up, but typically resolved within an hour or two of starting the day. A pattern that, in my experience, almost always warrants a closer look at what's happening during sleep, rather than during the waking hours. She was not a snorer in any dramatic or obvious way, nothing like the kind of audible disruption Robert's wife had been describing, but she did acknowledge that her husband had occasionally mentioned that her breathing seemed irregular at night, something she'd dismissed as him being a light sleeper and overly sensitive to normal nighttime sounds. Her sleep study told a different story. Her apnea was less severe than Robert's, but the events that were occurring happened with enough frequency and generated enough cardiovascular activation to be clinically meaningful. And her morning blood pressure readings on the study nights correlated directly with the nights on which she'd had more apnea events in the early morning hours. We implemented positional changes and a mild intervention for her airway, and her morning headaches resolved almost entirely within about 2 months, something she hadn't thought was connected to sleep at all until we traced the pattern back and made the change. The morning headache story is one I want to linger on for a moment because it's underappreciated as a symptom that points specifically toward nighttime cardiovascular and respiratory events. When the blood vessels experience repeated constriction and dilation cycles during sleep apnea events, and when carbon dioxide levels shift with each cycle of stopped and restarted breathing, these changes can trigger the same kind of vascular headache that other triggers produce, but because it happens during sleep, the person wakes up with the headache already established rather than experiencing its onset while awake. If you consistently wake up with a headache that was not there when you fell asleep, and if it tends to resolve as the morning goes on, that pattern is worth discussing with your doctor specifically in the context of what we've talked about today. If you fall into any of these categories, and if you also happen to be a back sleeper, this conversation is for you specifically, not as a reason to panic, but as a reason to pay deliberate attention to something that, once adjusted, can make a genuinely meaningful difference in how well your cardiovascular system recovers each night. Now let me give you the practical guidance, because understanding the problem is only useful if you also understand what to do about it. And the practical steps here are far more manageable than most people initially expect when they hear the word cardiologist and immediately brace for dramatic lifestyle interventions. The simplest and most immediately actionable change is to shift to sleeping on your left side. The left side specifically, not just either side, because these positions are not identical in their cardiovascular effects, and the distinction genuinely matters. Sleeping on the right side positions the heart in a way that can increase the effort required for blood to return from the lower body in people with certain cardiac conditions. particularly those involving any degree of heart failure or compromised right heart function. The left side, by contrast, positions the heart more favorably for efficient venous return from the lower body, reduces pressure on the aorta, and keeps the airway considerably more open than the supine position does, simply because gravity is acting on the tongue and soft tissue laterally, rather than pulling them directly backward into the airway passage. This is not a small anatomical difference. It is a clinically meaningful one, and it's the reason that left-side sleeping is specifically what many cardiologists and sleep specialists recommend, rather than simply telling patients to sleep on either side. Many people who make this switch notice an almost immediate improvement in sleep quality, often reported first by their partner rather than by themselves, specifically in a reduction in the snoring that had become so normalized it had simply stopped being noticed as a symptom and started being experienced as just a feature of the person's sleeping presence. That snoring, it turns out, was a symptom of airway narrowing that the new position directly and mechanically relieves. The challenge, of course, is that sleeping position is one of the most deeply habitual behaviors a human being has. It's built over decades, sometimes more than 50 years of thousands of nights in the same default configuration, and the body has a remarkable tendency to return to its habitual position during the night without any conscious direction, often multiple times before morning. You can fall asleep on your left side with the best of intentions and wake up on your back having rolled there sometime in the early hours with no memory of the transition. This doesn't mean positional change is impossible. It means it requires a deliberate strategy rather than simply intending to sleep differently and hoping the intention persists through unconsciousness. There are practical techniques that work for most people. One of the simplest is placing a firm pillow or a tightly rolled blanket behind your back before you lie down, creating a physical barrier that makes rolling backward into the supine position uncomfortable enough to interrupt the transition and encourage the body to return to the side position rather than complete the roll. This feels awkward and strange for the first week or two, and then, for most people, becomes entirely unremarkable and eventually unnoticeable. Some of my patients have used a tennis ball in the back pocket of a sleep shirt for the same purpose, an old physical therapy trick that sounds silly but is genuinely effective for many people. There are also purpose-designed positional sleep devices, essentially wearable wedges that create positional feedback when the person rolls backward, that are available and reasonably affordable for people who find the pillow method insufficient on its own. I want to address something about the morning routine as well, because there's a specific piece of this that many people miss even after they've started working on the nighttime position. If you wake up on your back, which you likely will during the adjustment period, don't simply lie there for a while before getting up. Move on to your left side, stay there for a few minutes, and then get up. This small additional step ensures that the final phase of your sleep and the initial part of your morning awakening is occurring in the more cardiovascularly favorable position, rather than in the one that was creating strain during the hours before. I also want to address something important here, which is that positional change alone, while genuinely helpful and absolutely worth doing immediately tonight, is not a complete solution for someone with significant obstructive sleep apnea, and I want to be honest about that distinction rather than leaving the impression that a pillow behind the back solves the full picture. If you have been told you have sleep apnea, or if everything we've discussed today sounds deeply familiar in a way that goes beyond casual recognition, particularly the pattern of snoring with observed pauses in breathing that others have described to you, please bring this conversation directly to your doctor and ask specifically about a formal sleep evaluation if you haven't had one. Sleep apnea is treatable, its treatment is effective, and the cardiovascular benefit of treating it adequately is real and well documented across decades of research and hundreds of thousands of patients. Changing your sleeping position is a meaningful and often dramatically effective first step that anyone can take immediately without any medical intervention at all. But for some people, that step works best as part of a larger picture that includes a proper evaluation. And if the evaluation points toward a treatable condition, getting that treatment is genuinely worth the initial inconvenience of the process. I've had patients who thought they'd simply have to live with poor sleep and difficult to manage blood pressure forever, who discovered through this conversation and the evaluation it led to that they had a highly treatable condition that nobody had ever specifically looked for and whose quality of life improved substantially once it was addressed. Don't let inertia keep you in a situation that doesn't have to be permanent. I think about so many of my patients who've spent years, sometimes decades, sleeping on their backs without ever once connecting that habit to the fatigue they feel every morning, despite a full night in bed. The blood pressure that refuses to stabilize the way their medication should allow it to, The headaches that show up specifically in the early morning before anything else in the day could have caused them. These aren't random symptoms. They're a coherent story that makes immediate sense once you understand what's been happening cardiovascularly during the night, and once you hear that story clearly, acting on it becomes obvious rather than difficult. So here's what I want you to take away from today. Tonight, before you lie down, think about your default sleeping position. If you're a back sleeper, move a firm pillow or a tightly rolled blanket behind your back before you sleep, something that creates enough physical friction to discourage a return to supine during the night without requiring you to be fully awake to manage it. Try this for 2 weeks consistently before drawing any conclusions, because sleep habit changes take time to settle and your body will resist them initially simply because change itself is uncomfortable before it becomes familiar. Pay attention to whether your morning energy is different, whether your blood pressure readings first thing in the morning look different than they have been, whether you notice anything shifting in how rested you feel when you wake up. And if the picture we've discussed today sounds like it's been describing your nights for years, bring this specific conversation to your doctor at your very next appointment. I think about so many of my patients who've spent years, sometimes decades, sleeping on their backs without ever once connecting that habit to the fatigue they feel every morning, despite a full night in bed. The blood pressure that refuses to stabilize the way their medication should allow it to. The headaches that show up specifically in the early morning before anything else in the day could have caused them. These aren't random, unconnected symptoms. They're a coherent cardiovascular story that makes immediate sense once you understand what's been happening during the night. And once you understand that story clearly, doing something about it becomes an obvious decision rather than a difficult one. Before you go, think of someone in your life who snores heavily, who always seems tired despite getting enough hours of sleep, or who has been told their blood pressure is difficult to manage consistently, and send them this video. This is exactly the kind of information that gets overlooked in standard 15-minute appointments and makes a real difference when someone finally hears it explained clearly in a way that connects the specific symptoms they've been experiencing to a specific and addressable cause. And if you want to know the one supplement that I discuss with almost every cardiovascular patient over 60 regarding sleep quality and nighttime blood pressure regulation, the one with the most consistent research behind it for exactly this combination of concerns, that's precisely what I'm covering in the next video, so don't miss it. This video is intended for general educational information based on clinical experience and published research, and is not a substitute for a conversation with your own doctor, who knows your specific cardiovascular history far better than I ever could from all the way over here. If you are experiencing any sudden neurological symptoms, chest pain, or anything that might indicate a cardiac emergency, please seek immediate medical attention rather than watching videos. Take good care of yourselves, and I will see you in the next one.